Mamluks, translated from Arabic, belonging, a military caste in medieval Egypt, recruited from young slave men of Turkic and Caucasian origin. The beginning of the formation of this class was laid in the first half of the 13th century by Malik Salih, the sovereign of Egypt, from the Ayyubid dynasty. He bought several thousand slaves, with whom the markets of Asia were filled in this time. As a result of the devastating wars of Genghis Khan, chose from them mainly young natives from South Russia and the Caucasus, taught them to military exercises. Those made up a special corps of troops of 12,000 people and gave him a name, Mamluks. The use of slaves in the Islamic context was practiced even under Muhammad and under the first caliphs. They were mafwa, that is, people dependent on their masters. During the Umayyads, mention was made of Khurrams and Mamluks. These terms denoted personally not free people. The Caliph's guard was recruited from non-Muslims. Detachments of slaves numbered from several hundred people to several tens of thousands. Some of the slave guards were the Caliph's guards. At one point, the Mamluks rebelled against their masters, overthrowing them and seizing power in Egypt. Even after the conquest of this region by the Turks, the influence of the Mamluks on local affairs was significant. The protective equipment of the Mamluk warrior consisted of a yashman, battle dress padded with cotton. It was in the form of both a robe and a shirt, chainmail and lamellar armor, jalshan. A turban served to protect the head of a simple warrior. Rich Mamluks wore metal helmets with chain-mail aventails. In the 15th century, ring-plate armor was most widespread. The main weapon was a bow. They were also armed with spears, swords, sabers, and clubs. Were also armed with crossbows, which were actively used during sieges and sea battles. From the end of the 14th century, the Mamluks began to use artillery. During the campaign, the Mamluk warrior had only one horse, as well as one or two camels, for carrying luggage and equipment. The Mamluk army did not have uniform, but many wore red or yellow clothing. Most of the banners were yellow, as this color was the color of the former Ayyubid dynasty. The main distinction of the officers was the belt decorated with gold, silver, and precious stones. In the Napoleonic army, the Mamluks were planned to be armed with pikes, but this idea was soon abandoned. Instead, they got special battle axes, carbines, trombone shotguns, a pair of pistols for a rider, clubs, daggers, and sabers of a special design, the famous Middle Eastern scimitars. The scimitar, or kilich, was not heavier than an ordinary light horse saber, but its design features made it possible to inflict terrible chopping wounds. It did not have the same reliable protection of the hand, which made it possible to skillfully fence, but required an excellent skill from the rider. Mamluks, dressed in harem pants and turbans, wrapped in many layers around their heads, and practically fulfilling the functions of protective weapons. Also, as Napoleon notes, some wore chain mail and helmets. The complex of military and physical training among the Mamluks was called Furusya. It included archery, fencing, exercises with a spear and other weapons, and wrestling. The most important skill for the Mamluk was archery. The Mamluks were also trained in the use of a crossbow, on horseback, and on foot. As a great training, the Mamluks were hunted, which was organized like the Mongol, during which large-scale raids on animals were carried out. The Mamluk cavalry was trained in maneuvering, false retreats, and other techniques. The infantry was able to cover long distances and be ready to repel unexpected attacks. The infantry was also trained to act effectively against cavalry. It must be said that the Mamluks rarely used foot soldiers in battles, in most cases relying on cavalry. Cavalrymen from elite units were trained in combat operations on foot, and they knew how to build field fortifications. During the battle, the Mamluks tried to choose the most convenient position in front of the hills in order to avoid a surprise attack by the enemy in the rear. The formation of the Mamluk army on the battlefield was traditional, with a center and two flanks. If the enemy's army was small, then the Mamluks tried to surround it. On the contrary, if there were more enemies, then the Mamluk commanders tried not to deploy troops on a wide front. One of the main tactical techniques of the Mamluks was bombarding the enemy with a hail of arrows. This is how the Mamluks managed to stop the Crusaders near Gaza. All Mamluk officers had land plots, yurts, or other profitable places, granted to them for their service by the sultans. The owners of the yurts were exempt from taxes, but during the war they were obligated to march with a detachment of armed people. Yurts were not inherited, and being the property of the sultans, were given into conditional possession. Baybaras significantly increased the salaries of the Mamluks. In addition to the monthly salary, the Mamluks once every 6 months or a year received a certain amount to cover the cost of clothing. The soldiers also received a daily meat ration, and once every 2 weeks the amount to buy food for a horse. In addition to the income received from the yurt, the Mamluk officers received rich gifts before the campaign, as well as with the accession of the new monarch. At the beginning of the 15th century, the salary of a simple soldier was 3 dinars, and the salary of an officer was 7 dinars. Don't forget to rate this video, and I'm open for suggestions for the topic of the next video in the comments below. After the surrender of the Eastern Army in Egypt, its troops were allowed to return the continent without hindrance. In addition, anyone could follow the invaders. There were not too many of them. In total, less than 1,000 settlers arrived in Toulon and Marseille, most of whom served in the army or administration. It was these people who became the basis of the famous Mamluk squadron. In 1802, the squadron was officially transformed into the Mamluk Corps, and a special decree allowed the soldiers to use the clothes and uniforms that they brought with them from Egypt. Commanders of the companies were appointed from the Mamluks, Ibrahim and Saloum. In the same year, the Mamluks were officially included in the Guard and accompanied Napoleon to his coronation in December 1804. During the years of the empire, the Mamluk company was organizationally part of the regiment of horse rangers, which means it was part of the Old Guard, the elite part of the entire French army. The baptism of fire of the Mamluk Guards took place during the famous Battle of Austerlitz a year later. They took part in the Battle of Pultusk, Preußisch Eylau, and in the Spanish Company. In 1812, the Guards found themselves in distant Russia. However, they did not participate in the battles. The Emperor tried to protect his most devoted soldiers until the last moment. After the news of the defeat at Waterloo, the surviving Mamluks faced an unenviable fate. In Provence, where the Guardsmen were quartered, pogroms took place. The quarter of Marseille, where the Mamluks and their families lived, was massacred by the rebellious mob. Thus ended the brilliant and glorious history of the French Mamluks, one of the most unusual units of the Grand Army.